Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. This is the second part of my playthrough of Upfront and continuing the scenario which is set during the Burma campaign of 1942. Now when I last left you, the Japanese were doing extremely well. All of their groups were pressing forward and managing to keep within, I'd say, reasonable cover, and also entrenching wherever possible, partly for their own protection to make them much tougher nuts to crack, but also because this deliberate action spends the deck. And it's perhaps a little bit gamey, but it advances the passage of time and it forces the already slightly desperate British side to act faster and possibly even a bit recklessly, which would be what the Japanese want. It would be marvellous for them if the British could be compelled to advance against them when they're in such an advantageous position. For the British part, they have been struggling with an early inertia, which may not just represent a hesitancy which would be understandable after months of defeat at the hands of the Imperial Japanese Army. It's been a long and hideous road for the British Empire and Commonwealth from December 1941 to March 1942, but also the fact that the Japanese have simply moved faster. The British are trying to get their act together, trying to press forward, seize this part of the town, hold the road open so that the column they're trying to guard can break through. But they simply have been behind. The Japanese have been quicker off the draw. They have managed to advance one of their groups, Group A, to the outskirts of the town, but they've already lost one man, and the rest of them found themselves pinned until quite recently. So the British really need to up their game if they hope to get anywhere. Now, their hand at the start of their next turn is actually looking quite encouraging. They finally have a movement card and they have hill terrain in hand. So it makes the most sense to keep the armoured car as a bit of a backstop to provide fire support while the fire group presses forward to try and support these poor fellows who are in the town. So the British are going to advance that group and I think hope that they don't run into anything unexpected on their way to this hill. There's not much else they can do at the moment, but they do have a concealed card and they do have a fire card, which hopefully, if they can just get their boys that little bit closer, they'll be able to make use of. That rally card may well come in handy fairly soon, we'll have to see. And so they draw, that's their sole action. Okay, another rally card. The Japanese, for their part, they're broadly in a good position, but perhaps they may want to press forward even more. They are inferior to the British in marksmanship, so at longer ranges the British have an advantage, whereas the Japanese strengths come into play when they close. So as the British are obligingly advancing their units, it does make sense for the Japanese to match their movement to a degree. And the temptation for the Japanese here is to take a risk. They have a movement card. It's very tempting to push their scouting group forward. They can continue to benefit from the cover of the woods or light jungle, as it is in this scenario. The only downside of moving forward is they lose their recently constructed entrenchment. So they're going to press ahead, see if they can cause more problems for the Brits, and also, in a way, give the British a bit of a dilemma. Shots fired at that group may be wasted to a degree because it's a tiny scouting group. But on the other hand, if the British allow them to press too far in unhindered, they could cause them problems. Either way, it's a potential distraction from the larger and more tactically important Japanese groups. Also, happily for the Japanese, because that was a movement card, it does not count as an action taken, which means that they can discard a card. And they are going to gleefully discard that wire card onto the British. Now, Normally, with the most terrain types, you can reject it if it's discarded on you, but wire cannot be rejected. So much to their dismay, the British, pressing forward to try and get to that hill, find their passage is barred by an obstacle that they're going to have to get round. The Japanese can be very smug about that. They'll draw their cards to bring their hand back up to 4. Back to the British. This is not good. They are stuck in wire. The only consolation they have is that their firepower is now 7 because they're somewhat closer to all the Japanese groups. Now, because of their marksmanship special ability, they can use this card. And it's very tempting. The question is, I'll switch that back because the Japanese did not fire at the armoured car last turn. Now the question for the British is, they can use this card, but do they target the small Japanese group, or do they try and take out some members of the bigger group? There's pros and cons to both. There's a higher chance they can do some damage to that lower morale group there, but they're still under cover even though they're moving. That group's a much tougher nut to crack, and also firing at that large group means 6 card draws, which means more time spent. It's going to be a bit of a tough choice. Ultimately, the British decide that it is worth attempting a shot against the larger group. There's no way they'll break the Japanese squad anytime soon. In fact, the Japanese have suffered no losses whatsoever. But if they can at least pin a couple of those men, it might keep the armoured car a little safer if they can pin the anti-tank rifle. And they will also reduce the firepower of the Japanese squad. The firepower of those 2 men is pitiful. The firepower of those 6 is more significant. So they're going to go for it. The Japanese, of course, are not going to take this lying down. And as they're entitled to play that as a concealment card, they're going to do it. So the British fire strength of 2 is reduced by 1 for being caught in wire, reduced by another 1 for jungle conditions, and then is -2 for the woods. Now, perhaps the Japanese are being a bit paranoid here, but then again, a lucky hit can interfere with that particular group, and they don't want to see that happen. So by playing this card, the British start with a base firepower value of -4, which is a very, very serious handicap. So Private Togami. See, just as well the Japanese did that. Private Togami's not bothered. Neither is Private Sakai, nor is Private Korata, nor Yumani, nor Fusano, and lastly Private Oi with his anti-tank rifle. No, fusillade of shots goes into the jungle, doesn't get anywhere near any of them. So there is precious little else the British can do. Their plan, their lovely advance has just been unhinged by that wire card, and now they desperately need to try and get another movement card. The Japanese, for their part, there's not too much for them to do, really. They have that very powerful firing card, but they can't use it in a conventional attack, so they really might as well take another pot shot at the armoured car. It spends time, and it's worth it for the attempt. They need to draw a 0 to score a hit. No, they fail. But once more, Private Oi is correcting his aim, and if they fire again next turn, he may do better. The Japanese replenish their hand and get another movement card. The god of movement is clearly smiling on the Empire of the Sun today. The British, for their part, are stuck. This is not good, really. They're going to take a chance and lose a rally and a woods card, which they'll discard. They'll draw 2 more cards and pray they get something they can use. Well, they get a gesture of defiance next turn, but no mobility still. The Japanese scouting group can now draw relieved breath. They've made it to a wall at the outskirts of the town. The Japanese anti-tank group is unable to fire again for lack of a shooting card. But in the interests of shooting some more British soldiers and also possibly taking out that armoured car, they're going to advance their anti-tank group now. So that lot are going to press forward. Note the relative range between the closest groups on both sides is now up to 3, so we're going to see a little more exchanges of fire as time passes. The Japanese will do nothing further and simply draw to replenish the hand. Look at that! They've been getting all the movement cards. As they did in 1942, they are running rings around the British. Now, for their part, the Brits have a horrendous choice to make, which is what they're going to do. Although they're vulnerable for moving, that group is doing so well for cover, they're virtually inviolate. However, this group here has more than enough firepower to try and scare off the Japanese scouting group. I doubt they will succeed, but for what it's worth, they're going to try. So that fire factor of 1 is instantly reduced to 0 because of the light jungle conditions. There's a further -2 because privates Fuchida and Fujita are crouched behind a wall. So it's going to be a bit of a despairing shot, but maybe it will achieve something. No, not a thing. We're just blazing ammo away without really achieving anything. And that lot is still stuck behind that obstacle. It's not looking good. If we'd taken no actions, or I should say if the British had taken no actions, that sniper card could have been discarded along with something else, maybe, to try and achieve something. But as that group fired, that counts as an action, so no dice this turn. Oh, thank goodness, and a flanking card. That was worth waiting for. Meanwhile, the Japanese... their options are a bit limited now too. They're going to advance their centre group, because it's about time it caught up with the others. And as the British seem to be doing very little by way of reaction, it makes sense to press forward while the going is good. Again, it's a risky manoeuvre, but perhaps not as much as one would think, because they're still in a gully. They can only be targeted at relative range 5. So the Japanese can move them forward and afford to wait for a good terrain card to come up. Now, because that is a Kawa card, they could hypothetically show it to the British player and say, look, that's a Kawa card. We Japanese can disregard these things and discard them anyway. There's no way they want to keep that. They want to free up their hand and keep those cards cycling. And they are rewarded. Look at that. Oh. Well, wherever everyone's headed, the Japanese, I think, are going to get there first. Now, the British have a really horrendous decision to make once more. They could use that movement card to get their men out of the wire, or they could give one of their groups flanking fire on the Japanese, which could be devastating. But that group would still be left in the lurch if they did that. It's really hard to know what to do. If I were the British, I would play it safe. I know that's the loss of a precious flank card, but with the Japanese closing in and soon to enjoy some rather good firepower ratings, it's a good idea to circumvent that obstacle and just get rid of it. Big disadvantage to the British, but they've not been having a good start to this scenario, so keeping their forces intact is really the best option at the moment. Hopefully, over the next couple of decks, they can try and reverse the situation that's been unfolding. The Japanese, for their part, are just tearing ahead. Not content with where they are, it's going to turn into a general advance because they're really feeling they can get away with it. So the scouting group is going to vault the wall, well, cautiously probe their way forward. The Japanese decide they're going to discard that stream card. They would like nothing better than to discard it on the British, but no British unit is moving at the moment, which is a great pity. But never mind, it gets it out of their hand, it passes the time, and they get some advantageous terrain cards. Now, if the Japanese get to play that on a group at relative range 5, it will be lovely for them. Excellent cover. The British, meanwhile, are sighing inwardly. That's a scenario-defined cower card, so they can do nothing about it. However, they're thinking the best thing to do would be to discard 2 cards. So they're going to discard the cower card on the Japanese scouts. Not surprisingly, at this range, the Japanese scouts are going to refuse to accept that terrain. So they turn their movement card laterally, and their relative range marker goes back to 2. So at such close range, they've made a sensible decision. It is not worth crossing that open ground where they'll be subjected to basically fire from the entire British squad, should the British so choose. And it just would not be worth it. Not worth chancing it. They're ahead. They don't need to take unnecessary risks. As for the sniper, which group to target? It would be worth the British while targeting the centre group, because that's where the Japanese squad leader and assistant squad leader are located. So when you discard a sniper card, the first thing you do is draw a random number to see what effect you have. You ignore the colour. That's a 2, which unfortunately is a miss. These are then left by the targeted squad as a reminder. On their turn, the Japanese will have the option of attempting to counter the sniper and maybe wipe him out. I'll show you how that works in a minute. The British draw, well, one card that's pretty useless, but another one that may be of some service, especially as the Japanese draw closer. Now, for the Japanese themselves, they have decided that the scouting group probably is a bit exposed over there, so they're going to plonk them in the gully. It's a bit of a shame about their lost advance, but never mind. They've found a sneaky approach to the town, which will keep those 2 men fairly safe until they get a good bit closer. Those 2 moving groups aren't going to really do any. Well, they certainly won't. They're waiting for good terrain. But while they're on the move, this group is going to try and target the British sniper. So the British sniper drew a 2. In order to take a shot back at him, the Japanese must draw a random number, and if it's a black number that's higher than 2, no, they fail to spot him. Had they succeeded, the British squad, to add to its woes, would have been marked with a sniper lost counter. and would no longer be eligible to make sniper attacks. So, all still well and good for the Japanese. A rally card? Not that they really need it. Back to the British then. It's very tempting to discard some terrain on the Japanese, but we also want to shoot at them because having lost a man, the British are rather desperate to get some payback, really. So this squad, which is no longer hampered by the wire and has enough firepower to deploy this card, is going to do so against that group. 4 reduced to 3 by the jungle. +1 because the target is maneuvering in the open. Well, not quite in the open, but they're moving, so they're visible. So back up to 4. -2 for the woods, or light jungle, I should say. So a base value of 2. Let's see how we do. Private Togami is pinned. The British fire continues. Private Sakai is also pinned. Private Karata is pinned. Goodness me, this is a bit of a turnaround. Private Yumani is not. Private Fusano is pinned. And that is significant because, as this marker shows, Private Fusano was helping Oi to carry his anti-tank rifle. And Private Oi himself is pinned as well. Now this has no immediate impact on them. But the next time they attempt to play a movement card, they will not be able to do so until someone is helping Oi with that gun. So although none of the Japanese soldiers have died, virtually that entire section has been forced to hit the dirt by incoming fire. So they're kind of running at the crouch, really. Those two are probably dragging the gun in a very awkward manner that, virtually guarantees they're not going to be using it anytime soon. And the only one who's really keeping his wits about him at the moment is Private Yumani. So that was actually a rather good round for the British. They've expended a lot of cards firing. And they've now got a rather huge firing card that they can't really use at the moment. But that was good, because for the moment, until the Japanese rally that group, that's one less large fire base that can bring fire to bear on the British, and it would hopefully leave them in disarray for long enough for the British to try and make something of a comeback. Of course, the Japanese aren't going to have too many problems there, and they're going to carry on playing to their advantage of not having to worry about the time limit as much as the British do. So Fuchida and Fujita over there are going to make an entrenchment attempt. Does not succeed. They can't really do anything. That group is going to attempt to rally on the run. They're going to play a rally 1 card. It's a bit frustrating for the Japanese. They've got a lot of low-level rally cards, but you can't play multiple rally cards on the same group in the same turn, which is a little bit annoying for them. So they're gradually getting it back together. Private Togami's shaken it off. Draw their card. Yet another pitifully small rally card. But they probably have enough cards to get themselves there eventually. Back to the British. Right. Relative range 3. They can generate 13 firepower points, which is great. They can fire that card. And they are going to do it because they were so successful the last time. It's worth trying to kill off a few of the Japanese as they advance. So Firepower strength of 6. The British really mean business now. Reduced to 5 for jungle, back up to 6 for movement, -2 for the wood. So it's a fire strength of 4. The Japanese have no concealment cards. If the British get lucky, they might inflict some losses this turn. Note, Togami is fine. They've hit Sakai's panic level. So we now need to check against his rout value. On a 5 or greater, he routs out of there. And you check the rout value there under the R. That's a 2. So Sakai has been shot. Now, some might wonder about the players who know this game and its stats well might wonder about the Japanese rout values. This does not represent a greater tendency to run away. Rather, it represents the unfortunately aggressive doctrine that was hammered into Japanese soldiers. And in many cases where a pinned soldier of any other nationality might be understandably tempted to stay pinned and keep his head down, in a tight spot the Japanese would often react aggressively. So what's probably happened here is that Private Sakai, sick and tired of being, hemmed in by a rain of bullets, has decided to yell a battle cry and rise to his feet, and instantly paid for it. Let's see what happens to the others. The same has happened to Private Kurata. Let's do a test for him. Private Kurata has fled. He's decided, very unusually for a Japanese in this conflict, that enough is enough. So Kurata has legged it. Incredible. Not good news for the Japanese. Yumani is unaffected. Fusano has to do a rout check. And he flees as well. Amazing. And lastly, Private Oi has to do a rout check as well. Private Oi flees, meaning that he abandons his anti-tank rifle because there's no way he can carry it. So that was a devastating blow to the Japanese. Private Sakai dead, and 3 men who've run for it. That was worth the British tearing through the first deck in terms of card draws and time spent. For what it's worth to the Japanese in the location they're presently in, the deceased Private Sakai has dropped his bolt-action rifle. And perhaps more vitally, Private Oi, in abandoning his weapon, has left behind the anti-tank rifle. Now, whether the Japanese are going to pause to pick it up or not is another matter, but that's quite a serious... So heavy is that weapon that if one of the Japanese pauses to pick it up, he's going to have to abandon his rifle in order to do it. It's not that brilliant a weapon to use. And despite the many times it's been fired at the British armoured car in this game, it hasn't really done anything useful. And just to cap off their changing fortunes, the British get a movement card. Things are suddenly looking a lot more optimistic for the British, and a bit down for the Japanese, because all of a sudden their plans are in disarray. It's going to be quite hard for them to turn this one around, but it's far from over. Remember, the Japanese squads have a very high break point, so even the loss of 4 men, which would have been catastrophic for the British squad, doesn't really faze them. They're going to advance their scouting group again, because clearly they're feeling the need to keep the pressure on the British after what's just happened. They have no real need for their rally cards anymore, because the only surviving members of Group C are unpinned anyway. So they are going to hold on to that fire card, because if they do happen to get a flank card or manage to close, they could fire that very powerful card. They're also not going to worry about retrieving the anti-tank rifle, because really their best route to victory now is to kill British soldiers. Never mind the armoured car. If its support is driven off, it will likely withdraw. That makes sound sense. So stick with what they can do. Each group still has anti-tank mines carried by one member of its team, so they're still in a strong position if the British tank gets, or armoured car, gets too close. So they're going to stick with what they've got and draw a card. Ooh, golly, they're a bit spoiled for choice with these powerful firing cards now. The British armoured car has been really, really quiet, so they are going to take a risk and bring it forward. So while the Japanese are now faltering a bit, the British smell blood. They're going to throw their armoured car into the fray in the hopes that its machine gun will achieve something. Just doing that puts it at relative range 4 to the Japanese scouting group. Can't target them because they're in a gully, but it's got 8 firepower, relative range 3 to those groups, and when that group emerges, it will have possibly firepower of 10, so that's nothing to sneeze at. The other British groups can't do anything, but they're going to sit tight with that for now, and, okay. A bit diminutive compared to what they were just chucking out, but firing is firing. The Japanese are going to take a risk and get rid of those two. They do need some usable cards now, and their situation is not irretrievable, but tricky. Trickier than it was. Now it seems to be their turn to not have very exciting cards to hand. Yes, the Brits, what to do? The British are going to quite happily roll their armoured car up the hill. That gives it hull down status. Not that that matters, because the only anti-tank weapon on the Japanese side is lying abandoned somewhere. But it does give them a firing bonus up there, and they can now see the enemy infantry in the gully. So that's a splendid development for them. In the meantime, the British are going to continue pouring it on from this group. They can't target that group because they're both in gullies, so it's going to have to be them. Bit of a hip shot, much weaker than what they've been throwing out, but it's worth doing. Using the same calculus we've used before, the British firing value is 0. And just to be sure, because they've seen enough of things getting unstuck already, the Japanese are going to play a concealed marker, a card on those two. So the British firing value is -1. They open fire. And perhaps unsurprisingly, it doesn't achieve anything. Except to burn cards and waste time. But the British are getting more firing cards, and they now have the firepower to put them to use because of the range. So it's entered a phase where things are looking fairly rosy because the British are at the right range to maximize their firepower. But the Japanese have cleverly negated that by keeping most of their men in gullies as much as possible. They did get unlucky over there, must be said. Japanese options are still horrendous. They do want to hang on to all these cards though, so they're just going to hold their breath, draw a card, and that's going to lead to some difficult choices in a bit. Back to the British. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . Well, I think this turn needs to see a fair bit of shooting. Every Japanese infantry unit is visible to the armoured car, and at relative range 3 with a firepower of 8, it is going to fire that card at the group in that gully. Now, they are the highest morale Japanese group, but the British are feeling lucky after what they achieved the other turn. So, firepower value of 3. The jungle effect and the benefit of the hill cancel each other out. It goes up to 4 because the Japanese are moving, but it's -2 again because they're in the gully. So firepower value of 2. And the British open fire. Sergeant Okimoto's not bothered. Neither is Corporal Togo. Private Yoruba with his LMG. Oh, he is. Private Yoruba is pinned. That's not so good for the Japanese. Private Kobayashi's not troubled. Oh, golly. Private Fujiyama's pinned. And lastly, Private Asante is pinned as well. Hey, so that rather heavy British fire is beginning to tell. Meanwhile, Group 1 over here, or sorry, Group C, I should say, has got enough firepower to turn this card onto that group over there. That might be worth doing. If the British can break one arm of the Japanese squad, that will be a significant step forward. So their base firepower is 1, allowing for all the various modifiers. They're going to shoot. Nope, Tagami's not troubled. And neither is Yumani. Okay. Well, it was worth a try, at any rate. And it does mean the British have burnt their way through a couple of more cards. And they're still getting fire cards. And a concealed one. That's good. Pretty much what they want at the moment. Now the Japanese are glad they kept those rally cards handy. They're going to play that one, Rally 4, to get all 3 of those men back on their feet. It's a pity about the wasted 4th one, but at this point the Japanese are just grateful that they were able to rally the whole lot with a single card. It's a bit dangerous doing anything else, so they're going to hold their breath and hope for something better. The British are still thoroughly enjoying themselves at this juncture. And the armoured car is going to fire on that group again. Same base value of 2, no concealed cards from the Japanese. And I'm just going to have to reshuffle the draw deck. Bear with me while I just play with a huge pile of cards. But things are beginning to move a bit more quickly for both sides now. Before they get too complacent, the British need to remember that not only has the Japanese squad not been broken, which is a condition of them winning, the Japanese squad has actually pushed further into the objective than they have. So by all means feel a bit cocky, but don't get too cocky. So here we go. Let's see if the armoured car can make another dent on Japanese Group B. So far, no. Sergeant Okimoto and Corporal Togo are both fine. Private Yoruba's less bothered than he was last turn. Kobayashi's not fussed. Private Fujiyama's got a bit nervous again. And lastly, Private Asante is fine. British will draw one card. Ooh, okay. Would be nice if they could use that one. It would be fairly lethal, but I think they might need to get in closer. Now, as for the Japanese, they're a bit stuck, really. They can attempt a shot from the hip, and they're going to, against that British group there. Not much chance of success, and it's already reduced to 0 by the fact that they're fighting in jungle, and the British are going to add a little extra insurance to make it -1. But again, the Japanese are trying to burn through the deck more quickly. So Sergeant Vesey's fine, Corporal Barnard's fine, Private Scarborough's fine, Private Hodge is fine, Private Shannon is fine, and so is Private Whitesell. So not surprising, really. Two men with bolt-action rifles advancing and firing from the hip as they come is not usually going to produce any decisive result, but it does speed the game up. Back to the British, they have this huge firing card, but the question is, can they use it effectively? And I'm afraid the answer, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, is no. They're tantalizingly near it, but they just can't. There is a temptation to get rid of some of their cards, but they may want that flat terrain themselves for ease of manoeuvring, particularly with an eye to that thing if they need to move it forward again. So the other thing is the British don't want to burn through the deck too quickly and miss good cards, so they're going to hang on to everything and they'll simply draw a card. Okay, that gives them an option for next turn. On the Japanese side, for the moment, they're just going to rally Private Fujiyama. And then draw a card. It is getting quite tense now. Right, the British have that card. They don't really want to expend it firing at that group because it's quite a weak firing card and they're pretty high morale. And targeting a big group again will burn through the deck more quickly. So British Group C is going to target Japanese Group C. Base value is 0. But again, the Japanese have learned a lesson in caution, so they're going to advance concealed, -1. Ooh, remarkably, the British still managed to pin Private Tagami. But are not so successful in Private Yumani's case. And they will leave that there. Maybe next turn will be the time to do some discarding now that they've got the stream card. Japanese, in the meantime, they don't know what sort of firing cards the British have, but given that armoured cars negated the value of their gullies, they're going to settle with halting movement, particularly on their men with the lowest morale. They're going to come up against another wall, which affords them a bit more protection, although unfortunately not from that angle. The wall's split cover rating is something to bear in mind. The group directly opposite your wall has a -2 penalty when firing over it, but a group firing obliquely at you only gets a -1. So it's protection of a sort, but it's not brilliant. They don't have a rally card for Tagami, which is rather serious. But they're going to hope for the best, draw some cards and see what happens. Ooh, they've been waiting for something like that. Back to the British, they are going to do some discarding. So they're going to chuck a stream down on the main Japanese group, their fire support group really. Rejection of stream terrain is not allowed. So the Japanese emerge from their gully, expecting to be in a good position to get at the British. They find there's a stream in their way. Oops. The other card, the pillbox card, scenario-defined cower card, the British will attempt to throw down on this group. Now they are going to exercise their right of refusal by turning that into a lateral move because they don't want to lose the cover of the light jungle. However, that comes with a penalty because they veered away from the area where the discarded weapons were dropped, and their relative range marker goes back down to 1 because they've had to go back on themselves to avoid that deadly clear terrain. So that's discarded, but we've managed to deflect the Japanese. Really ought to stop saying we, shouldn't I? I'm trying to be neutral here, trying to be neutral. So that wasn't too bad a turn for the British, even though it was just discarding. So drawing some fresh cards. Still no movement for the British. They're not really going for drive this time. Now this would be quite awkward normally. The Japanese are at relative range 3. Maybe the British have made a mistake, or maybe they haven't. The Japanese do need to get into a good firing position. They need to get closer in order for their firing group to play that card. But before they can do that, they need to do something about that stream. Luckily, one of their movement cards is a forward card. So despite the fact that it exposes them horribly, they're going to make a move to try and cross that stream over there. In the meantime, their friends over here, conscious of their very weak firepower, are going to start looking for a flanking position. Specifically, a flanking position that they'll take up against Group C. Now they've only played movement cards so far, which means they can also discard a wire card. And they're going to discard it on the main British group, because they have to have cover of some sort while they execute all these chancy manoeuvres. As for the British, okay, things have got a bit hairy again. They still can't use this beautifully big firing card, or can they? Oh, they can. It's a bit of a long shot from this group to that group, but it might be worth them trying it. So firepower of 7, reduced for wire and jungle to 5, reduced again because of the distance, increased because they're on the move, decreased for cover. Still a firepower strength of 4, that's nothing to sneeze at. Private Fuchida is pinned. Private Fujita is pinned as well. Things are looking a bit dark now. However, they're both still intact and they're still on the move, and if they succeed in getting some cover, they'll have achieved a flanking position, so that's not so good. So the next British action is going to be to get these gentlemen here to see if they can finish them off. So effectively firepower 0 because of the jungle, and -1 between the movement and the cover. Oh, Private Fuchida has to do a routing check. And he flees. Good heavens. And he takes his anti-tank mine with him. That's not so good for them. That's just enough for Private Fujita to take. Oh no, it's not. No. No, he is still there. He's still flying the flag for Group A. That was not a bad turn for the British at all. So they draw their 2 cards. They'll get to do more shooting next turn. Meanwhile, for the Japanese, huge sigh of relief all round. The most important thing for them is to get away from that vulnerable position. So the main group, their main surviving group, has found some brush to get under, where they can start exacting some vengeance, hopefully. The other 2 Japanese units are just going to have to hope for the best this turn. But they have got more movement cards, so the main group has options and is no doubt going to try and bring its considerable firepower a bit closer to their British opponents. So I've run this stretch into nearly another hour, so I'm going to leave it there. The situation has changed dramatically. It went from early Japanese successes, they were advancing well, they picked off one of their British opposite numbers, and they generally had the British on the back foot, even though the British squad was largely intact. We've now seen some significant changes come in. So the Japanese have continued their advance, but it's uneven. They've encountered difficult and unexpected terrain. It's forced them to shift. Their squad's cohesion is becoming a bit strained, and groups are becoming a bit widely separated. They've suffered rather serious losses in the sense that one of their men has been killed, and an unprecedented 4 of them, I think, or is it 5? Let's see. No, it's only 4, but an unprecedented 4 men have fled the field. It's very unusual for the Japanese. A couple of others are pinned, and those flanks are now extremely fragile, and the Japanese are going to have to watch that, because if they're reduced to a single group, it has a reductive effect on hand size to represent your decreased tactical options. The British are now pretty much flushed with success, but they too need to be careful. The time limit on the scenario is nearly half gone, and if they are not careful, the approach they've taken, where they've just gone for bringing firepower to bear, partly dictated by the fact that they just haven't been getting the movement cards, it may not break the Japanese squad in time. And if they fail to break this blocking force in time, they will be crushed by the stronger Japanese forces coming up behind them. They must gain access to this road, and they must hold it open. And they may not achieve that if they just sit there plinking at the Japanese all day. No, they're going to have to hop forward at some point, because, as I said earlier, the Japanese are actually in the town and pressing towards the vital areas that need to be held, whereas the British at best are just in the outskirts. And as you can see from what's happened to this group here, with the second wire card it's had to endure this game, the Japanese are not the only ones who are running into obstacles. So it's getting really tense now. The game could still go either way, although I think I'm beginning to see a growing British advantage in this business. But then that was what the Japanese would have said of themselves at the end of the previous video. So let's see what happens. I'm looking forward to it, and don't know when I'm going to be able to play the next session, but hopefully it won't be too long. We shall see. Stay tuned to this one, all of you who are following this engagement, and as ever, thank you very much for tuning in. Goodbye.